All right, picking up with part two of our conversation with John Fonte, Dan Schmidt and I are here, and Dan has a question.
Yeah, John, a very interesting conversation in part one that I hope everyone will take note of. But if you could, I'd like to comment a bit, if you could, on philanthropy and the role philanthropic institutions played as we sort of look over the last 20 to 30 years, a generation, if you will, of sort of the way history was in the 70s into the 80s into this transition where we find the hostility, a sort of rejection of American identity, which means a rejection of the narrative of traditional and stood up against time narrative of the American experience. So, John, if you'd care to comment sort of on what happened with philanthropic institutions, which are characterized as left, somebody who sort of stayed agnostic and in the middle, and then on the right, sort of what transpired with respect to the role of philanthropy, John, in the way this understanding of American experience, American identity has gone.
Yes, well, of course, philanthropy philanthropy is essentially the handmaiden of the universities. I mean, as the universities changed, so did philanthropy. They're hand in glove. Yes, we could go back to the last 5 years, the last 20 years. We could even go back, as some of you remember, back to 1954 and the congressional investigation of philanthropy, which suggested that, look, they said, well, philanthropy, this is the Reese Commission, Congressman Reese, saying, well, what they're interested in is transforming America. And at that time, he said in a more socialist direction and away from what the founders did, away from free enterprise, and this set off a controversy, but a lot of the facts that they presented were actually accurate back in 54. Then we fast forward, we go forward into the 1980s, and we had a conservative philanthropy at that point, seeing the chance of, well, let's take a look. Let's get the Cold War liberals, the Arthur Schlesingers, the Arthur Links, together with Walter McDougall and some of the more right of center professors, and come up with an accurate pick. These were the days of nation at risk. You know, kids are not learning history and civics. Nation at risk. 1983 was even before Bennett. Nation at risk was under the previous Secretary of Education, but was part of the Reagan administration. So let's study American history, the Constitution, the founding. So people were sort of in agreement. We came up with it, and it was we mentioned Paul Gagnon, remember, came up with a document. And then what happened eventually, though, is that it was sort of the project director was a radical professor at UCLA, Gary Nash, who had written Red, White, and Black, as I mentioned, I think, earlier, and he sort of took over and put it made it definitely in a progressive direction, a left direction, and was denigrating some of the earlier heroes in American history. So that the American National History Standards ended up condemned by the United States Senate, 99-1. So that was the end of that project. Then we still, some of us were discussing this at the time, and let's still come up with a good sort of curriculum process that would be helpful for and essentially necessary for American citizenship. This came up with the Bradley Project, E Pluribus Nunum, in 2008. And you look at that document today, it's evergreen. I mean, it was sort of way ahead of its times. You can look at it. There's no pretty much agree with everything. I think in the document, there might be some slight things that at this point I would change, which was sort of the emphasis on America as an idea, which sort of that concept more or less hijacked by the progressives. The idea turned into the progressive idea, and it really wasn't the idea of the founding. The founders changed. So we're also a history, a people, a culture, a nation. Not just we are an idea, but we're also a people or a nation. So we're those two things. But Bradley in 08 pretty much had it right. But then this idea of this transformation, and going back to 1954, they were talking about transformation, the philanthropy. Well, philanthropy sort of came out with the early thing right after 08. One reason, by the way, we couldn't get some of the liberals on board with us in 08, like Bill Galston, was that was right in the middle of the 08 election. they wanted to sign on with Obama, and they didn't want any affiliation with anything right of center at that time. So they don't. So he ended up breaking with the project. Remember, we did, and wouldn't agree to the final document. But that was strictly political. And then what happened, of course, was 5 days before the election, famous words were spoken by a man soon to be president of the United States, who said, "We are 5 days away from the fundamental transformation of the United States of America." Fundamental transformation. This is something what philanthropy had been saying for 60, 70 years. They just had to do a different way of doing it. In the past, it may have been an emphasis on economics. John Dewey, socialism. He was a social democrat. Now it was race, ethnicity, and gender. And this now we had a new president who's talking about fundamental transformation, but emphasizing race and gender, and people, let's look like America, and so on. So that was a big push, and that sustained for a while. But then came the biggest push of all, which was the George Floyd incident, which set off philanthropy and the universities more than anything else. And all you have to do is go back and read documents written by leading experts in philanthropy and by major universities in May and June. I think the Floyd incident was somewhere in late May, if I remember. So this was May, June, July 2020. Then you look at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Was it Stephen Hines? His document right after George Floyd. So it was one of discussion of America as one of systemic racism, a rejection of America's past, total rejection of historic America. This came out from foundation after foundation, philanthropy after philanthropy, university after university. They're all saying the same thing. We have to get rid of it. And then the president, and then the candidate for president, Joe Biden, was saying the same thing. We have to get rid of 400 years of systemic racism. And then the homophobia, the transphobia, whatever, all the other phobias. Well, America was wrong from the beginning. So this, it was George Floyd was an exponential explosion at that point. That was the key thing. But it had been building up since the election of 2008, since the national history standards, and way back. You want to go back to the 50s or the 40s or the 30s. A lot of philanthropy was involved in, maybe Marxism is. So now we have a new form of cultural Marxism. It's not the worker, it's not the proletariat. They're long gone. They turned out to be white supremacists after all. It's ethnicity, race, and gender. They changed the gender. So what we have now, and the reason I'm opposed to conservative accommodationism is let's look at our current situation. What's the correlation of forces as a Marxist? We're in the middle of a revolution, a cultural revolution, a political, cultural revolution that attacks not simply our economy. It's not simply big government. It's politics, it's culture, it's our manners and mores, as Tocqueville would have said. It's every aspect of American life, whether, what's a man or a woman. We weren't arguing about this at the time we wrote the Bradley report in 2008. I don't remember any discussion of what is a man. Can you describe a woman? The liberals at the time would have been able to define a woman. I think they wouldn't be able to say, "Well, I'm not a biologist. I can't do that. I can't define that." So we have, the basic core of civilization. What is a human being with the rise of transhumanism? All of these absolute core issues of the heart of our civilization are. So we're not simply in what's called a culture war. That we're in a civilizational war. We're in a discussion about a way of life. It's way beyond a question of what bathroom you use or this or that or culture. It's very deep, and it's civilizational, and it's in a way Jacobin, like the French Revolution. We're involved in a new French Revolution, but that's what we're in. And American, let's say, conservative accommodationists are seeking to sort of accommodate the French Revolution. As Burke reminded us, you can't accommodate. There's not really any. How do you compromise with what's a man with a woman? How do you compromise in America is the land of systemic racism? How do you compromise on George Washington was an enslaver? These are weaponized concepts that they're not meant for compromise. They're not stated in good faith. They're not stated, okay, we're here. These are our views. What are your views? We'll come up with a consensus. These are bad faith, weaponized concepts that are designed to deconstruct and delegitimize the American constitutional republic, and they have to be rejected. And we have to come up, instead of working with them as a compromise, we have to come up with an alternative. As I mentioned earlier, what the alternatives were, going back to the Bradley report, but the latest work at Claremont and Hillsdale and all the other places that I mentioned, including, some of the major think tanks. So this work is out there. It's been there. Heritage would be another place. And the book that we just mentioned, Up from Conservatism, also lays out essentially an alternative vision of what an American narrative should be, and what it is an embrace of an American civilization from the beginning, from the founders to today. This is a civilization that I think I mentioned in the paper has essentially invented practically every invention of modern history, whether it's the telephone, the telegraph, the airplane, the submarine, light bulb, the computer. Everything we use today was essentially created by air conditioning, television, created by Americans. So this is a civilization, and the people we've gone before us, we should be eternally grateful to these people, not attacking them as white supremacists and sexists and homophobes and transphobes and the like.
Do you think, John, there might?
So that's where we should stay.
Yeah, you think there might be a version of conservative accommodationism within philanthropy?
Yes, I mean, you guys would know more about it than I would, but if we're seeking some form of consensus with philanthropy, which is 95% dominated by progressive ideology, if that's what we're seeking, we're not going to, and we bring in all of the stakeholders. Well, the stakeholders are all going to be on one side. So I don't know if anyone was actually doing this, but I think they probably are, just given from hints from what you're saying, and people who are watching it more closely than I am. I'm watching universities, but this is obviously going on in philanthropy. So yes, an accommodation would be to accept some of their premises and to believe that they were somehow operating in good faith, where they're operating in bad faith. I mean, they have an agenda. They have an absolute agenda. So which is to, as they've openly said, fundamentally transform the United States of America.
John, following up on Mike's question, this is a real challenge. I would think you might consider a real challenge in the sense that philanthropic institutions on both sides of the aisle have become so transactional. And we'd get you to comment on that, because as you say, this is in your view, a civilizational combat that we're in, even over and above just a cultural link to one nation or one particular geographic area of the world, that it's a civilizational. Is that tension a serious one, in that what instrumentalities can one pick up, either on the right or left, if one wants to not so much use the word common ground, but find some way to get back to those earlier examples where at least you'd find some symmetry in sort of understanding of principles, values, and how fundamental they were to creating an architecture of a society which could work, John.
Yes, I mean, what's going on essentially is a repudiation of Western civilization. And I was just in Sweden a couple of weeks ago. I'm pleased to say that they are translating my book Sovereignty or Submission into Swedish, this new Swedish think tank, Ekos, which means home in Greek. And I think this is catching on in Western Europe and in Western civilization, that what we're involved is a civilizational war that seeks to assault and to deconstruct Western civilization, whole colonialism, the whole decolonization, which is taking place in England and France, and even a place like Sweden, which didn't have any colonies, but they're still accepting the concept of decolonization. They're accepting a little bit here that the West was horrible, they were colonized, they went and prevented the Indians from in India from killing their widows after when their husbands died. The end of sati was the British did in India, and there's a new book by an Englishman named Bigger, who was sort of a defense of British colonialism, and so he was pointing out some of the, yes, there were many negative aspects, but he's pointing out some of the positive aspects. So yeah, this is an attack on Western civilization, and I guess on all civilization. We're talking about what is a man and what is a woman. Philanthropy, let's say conservative philanthropy, this, in my view, would have to come up with a core, an alternative, as conservative education would have to, that we know we can't accept this. We know what a man and woman is. We know there are standards of right and wrong going back to Plato, going back to Christianity and Judaism. We know what the foundation of the West is. And we know what that challenge is too, the people that challenge it. Descartes or Rousseau or even later Nietzsche. But that challenge was sort of within the West. It was within an argumentation, even though they rejected core tenets of the West. So you'd have to start with a different grounds, and you can't have simply an instrumental discussion or instrumental project of, well, we're going to get together with all the foundations and put this out. I'm thinking here of, in the American context, of the current Mellon Foundation Monuments Project. They have a monuments project, and the purpose is to change the monuments, to get away from these white males and to include other people. Let's have people of color. Let's have transgender monuments. You can come up with some. There's some monuments to George Floyd, as I've no doubt seen. So the whole purpose of the Mellon Monuments Project is to redefine America, to change its monuments. There was some discussion of the Lincoln Monument in the park in Washington, D.C., where there's the slave who's thanking him, and this is somehow a problem for some people. So yeah, philanthropy is up to its neck in trying to delegitimize historic America and transform it and reconstruct it and change it. They want a new regime, as the leaders of the French Revolution did. That is the goal of all this. A new culture, a new history. They've come up with a new history. The last 5 years, the last 10 years. And you go to what's happening at, I reviewed the Minnesota standards 10 years ago, it was fine. Looked at it recently, it's a new country that's been redefined. So it's a new history, and the purpose of a new history is a new regime in the Aristotelian, Platonic sense of way of life, a new way of life, a new civilization. That is the end goal. That's the telos of the progressive project. So there cannot be a meeting of the minds, a common ground, a consensus on this instrumentality, because there is none.
Well, why don't we consider that an exhortative note on which to end, and thank John Fonte for joining us in this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.